wanted to talk about, there we go. I wanted to talk a little bit about historical parallels with Oz, with Ozma of Oz especially. Hold on, if I can get this working. Ah. Here, let me just do it this way. There we go. That works a bit better. My phone might die, but plugging it in was not working. Anyway, some historical parallels with the Oz series when it comes to Ozma of Oz, which I think is one of those types of analysis that is kind of tricky one to deal with. I have students who attempt the historical analysis and really fail. It's one of the ones that they struggle with the most, really. But as I was reading those last few chapters, if you reference the previous video, so I was reading those last few chapters. A lot of historical parallels really come up of significance. And one of the big ones with this book is just the development of technology, which was always something that Baum was really interested in. The way that technology was just rapidly developing. Book one came out in 1900, and if you think about just all the technology that came out just right at the end of the 19th century, just tons of pieces of technology. And so you had just sort of a cottage industry of a lot of writers, Bellamy being the one who's probably the most famous, Howells, imagining these technological utopias where, machines would do all the work for us, robots would do all the work for us. So Tick-Tock in book 3, Tick-Tock in Ozma of Oz, is the first robot in literature. Arguably, that's kind of an iffy proposition, but certainly one of the first robots in literature. Predates the word robot. The word robot came from Ralston's Universal Robots, came from a play in the 20s. So Ozma of Oz predates it, by a couple of years. But part of the response to this boom in technology was imagining these technological utopias and saying, in the future, robots would do all these different things for us. And if you're familiar with Warner Brothers cartoons and Mickey Mouse cartoons would do this thing years later, not the same period, but years and years later, you would have these cartoons sort of parodying that vision of the technological utopia. It was certainly something that was big in the 50s. So Wonderful Wizard of Oz was a big hit as a book in the very early part of the 20th century. Wizard of Oz, the movie, came out in 1939, but it wasn't actually very popular until the 50s, when it was played on television. Wizard of Oz, the movie, came out with the direct competition of Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is not a movie that has aged well for many reasons, but just in the context of 1939, Gone with the Wind was this massive hit. I think if you adjust for inflation, it's still one of the most profitable movies of all time. But it was this massive hit. That book was hugely popular, and the movie was hugely popular. So Wizard of Oz was really overshadowed by that. It might have been a big hit at the time if it weren't for Gone with the Wind. It got a lot of critical praise. It won it. The only Oscars it won were for the song and for a juvenile Oscar for Judy Garland. So, but the culture of the 1950s, which had that sort of technological utopia idea, that's really the period that embraced the Wizard of Oz movie. But ironically, because if you take that idea of this technological utopia, just something that shows up constantly in the Oz series, this idea of machines of the future and what interactions we'll have with automated people and what have you. What is humanity in a world where objects are able to think? That sort of theme just comes up constantly. But but if you look at the role of technology in book one, it's really just the wizard who's using it. And what does the wizard use it for? He uses it for tricking people, which is interesting that it really caught on in the 50s when there was so much imagery of technological utopia. So like the Warner Brothers cartoons that I was referencing, that were parodying these visions of technological utopia. A lot of them were just a lot of them were responding to these shorts. Warner Brothers cartoons were, especially in the 50s and before that, they were in front of movies. And so you would have these newsreels and shorts that would have these explanations of the new technology that's going to come along, and very sexist sort of imagery where it was the housewife of the future will use this particular gadget or what have you. So the Warner Brothers cartoons would sort of just parody that. And so it's interesting that Baum, who was very much interested in the turn of the century version of that sort of response, the counter response to the developments of technology at the time, who in the form of the wizard in book one was looking at how you could use that sort of technology to indoctrinate people and fool people, which is what the wizard was doing. I mean, he's using all of this technology to trick people into thinking that he's magical. He's used and like the green glasses. That's something that was kind of dropped from the series, but the idea that Emerald City's not really emerald is just he gets people to wear green glasses. All of that stuff, the manipulation of the public, that sort of idea. A lot of that is really directly tied with the technology that he was using, but was not really common in Oz itself. But the idea that you have this country unaware of technology, you have this person who doesn't have any sort of magical powers, but he has this awareness of technology. He's able to trick them into making him their leader. That's just something that shows up just constantly throughout the series. You have the Wicked Witch of the West is able to trick her part of the country into thinking she has power, but she's not a very powerful character, arguably. But you have the parallel with TikTok in book 3, the one we were just talking about, where you have TikTok, who's this very positive image of technology. The Wheelers are commonly interpreted as being a response to the developments in technology. They reference automobiles. Automobiles, of course, very, very new sort of concept. But automobiles being this threatening thing, certainly in the early development of automobiles, there was this concept that they were very, very dangerous, that they were dangerous to horses, that they were, all this anxiety tied with automobiles at the time. But as people grew to accept them, they were able to recognize that they weren't as dangerous. They're certainly dangerous, very, very dangerous, but they grew to accept them as part of their lives. But you have that sort of conflict between TikTok, who is able to think and is able to speak, but he remains obedient to Dorothy, who is his master, which is a fascinating thing to look at thematically because of how many images throughout the whole series have that sort of objectification depicted as a purely negative thing. So in the series, you have an image of technology being used to fool people in book 1. So if you have that sort of association, you said, how does Baum feel about technology? You could say, well, look at book 1. He's depicting technology as this mechanism for brainwashing people and turning them into materialists. And materialism is another big theme just throughout the whole series. Like the whole idea of the Emerald City being emerald, that's just fooling people into thinking that they live in this very rich city. So if you think about that 1950s parallel, the idea of, the kitchen appliance of the future being tied with this very deeply materialistic country, you have the wizard who's tricking people into thinking that he's very dangerous and powerful using technological imagery. He's also, that's very directly tied with his materialism. So very directly tied with this idea that his power is based on the illusion of power. His power is based on technological advancement, but his power is also based on his materialism. His power is also based on this image of wealth. My students read an article. Hopefully they read it. Who knows? But my students read an article by Zenita Fenton called "No Witch is a Bad Witch." It's about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was Baum's mother-in-law. I'm sure I will do a video specifically focusing on feminist analysis very soon. The feminist analysis stuff really comes in with the Gnome King and Ozma. So once we get to that section, that sort of hierarchical relationship and the sort of belittling patriarchal, patronizing nature of the Gnome King, that's a good one to talk about with feminist analysis. But there's Anita Fenton article. She talks about the emblems of power. So this idea of faking your own power, or faking someone, shows up just constantly throughout. So the depiction of technology is it's tied with this faking power. This idea of faking power through displays of material wealth, faking power through using technology to manipulate people. It predates, very much at the beginning of movies, but it predates a lot of that sort of tie between technology and convincing the public of something, fooling people with technology, that kind of idea. It predates that, but it sort of predicts that in many ways. But it ties that also, all that stuff is tied together: material wealth, technology, that sort of thing. But then you cut to book 3, and this is what Baum does constantly: is he directly contradicts any sort of easy interpretation that you might recognize from the text. He'll present something that's the opposite, and he'll undercut it in a way. So TikTok certainly functions as the opposite of the Tin Man in many ways. His lack of interest in being human, as opposed to Tin Man wanting to be more emotional and more human. TikTok has no interest in being emotional or being more human. So many of the characters recognizing objectification as basic evil of existence. TikTok says, I want to be an object. I don't want to, I have no will of my own. My will is yours. So you have those sort of opposite, seemingly contradictory sort of images that, as an argument, it would certainly undermine an argument, but, it creates that much more complicated array of different images that, in direct contrast with each other, really heighten the sort of stimulation. And he always keeps you on your toes, because there's no real easy interpretation of Baum, that's for sure. But if you're looking at book 1 as showing the anxiety of technology, Vivian Wagner, in her article Unsettling Oz, I've mentioned that before. Hush. I'm not talking about talking animals in this episode, so this is not your cue. Vivian Wagner talks about my phone's about to go out of power. But Vivian Wagner talks about that sort of contradictory conflict of hold on, where's my cord? Here's my cord. Okay, Vivian Wagner talks about, in her article Unsettling Oz, she talks about how that conflict of technological anxiety. Okay, there we go. That conflict of technological anxiety creates a sort of haunted quality. My dog. Of course, my phone is dying. My dog won't stop barking. So anyway, it creates this haunted quality where he's in constant conflict. And I would argue it undermines the argument. It doesn't really make it easy to recognize, does Baum support technological advancement? Does he think technological advancement is utopian? And always with Baum, that question of utopianism is a very complicated question. If it's just a pure, undiluted utopia, Vivian Wagner talks about this in her article also, but if it's just a pure utopia where Oz is entirely perfect and everything's running well, if it was really like a technological utopia, for example, there wouldn't be a whole lot of tension, but it's both a technological utopia and an agrarian utopia. Andrew Clark talks about this in his article. I'm blanking. Oh, Utopian Tensions. He talks about this in his article. It's a technological utopia in the sense that you have living robots who are good robots. They're not evil. They don't want to take over anything. They're not replacing humanity. TikTok, you can look at him as an embodiment of technological anxiety, but in a very positive sense, where he allays your technological anxiety by saying, he's just a servant. He is not taking over for humanity. This is a new kind of humanity. I mean, that's where a lot of the technological anxiety comes from. It's a new kind of humanity. It seems like this humanity might replace us. That's a lot of at the root of technological anxiety. But TikTok has no interest in replacing anyone. He's just there to help humanity. So if you talk about the wizard as an embodiment of technological anxiety, he's using technology to manipulate people, but TikTok is using it just to serve and help people. So you have two seemingly contradictory perspectives on technological anxiety. Now, here's where it parallels historical analysis. So you can recognize why is Baum so interested in that sort of thing. He was very interested in things like, a lot of stuff happening really in the 1890s, a lot of huge stuff happening in the 1890s. He was very interested in Thomas Edison as a character. You have a lot of articles that will point out that Thomas Edison was the inspiration for the wizard. You have a lot of people who say Baum is the wizard, and you have a lot of people who say Thomas Edison is the wizard, but the wizard is arguably a pretty awful person. He says, I'm a good man, but a bad wizard. He's not really a good man, arguably. That's one of his lies, arguably. But people will point out he's a character like Thomas Edison. There will make with the whole concept of the White City, with the World's Fair in Chicago. Baum lived in Chicago for a while. He never lived in Kansas, but he lived in Chicago for a while. So a lot of people will point out that kind of stuff where they'll say Baum is writing about this technological utopia. He has this concept of a technological utopia because he was inspired by the World's Fair. He was inspired by Thomas Edison, all these things that showing up. Now, here's the key. If you're doing historical analysis, and if you read a really good, solid historical analytical essay, it will do this too. Historical analysis is one of those types of analysis where you do need something else to support it. You do need some sort of concept to support it. The way I've been talking about technological anxiety, there's a model of how to take a historical parallel and make it really work effectively in analysis. So if you just said, if all you said was the wizard uses technology because he was inspired by Thomas Edison, there's a starting point. There's certainly an idea you can talk about, entirely valid sort of an observation. But how does that really help us understand the text on a deeper level? And that's the issue a lot of people have with historical analysis. So they'll say the wizard is based on Thomas Edison, or they'll say, there's a lot of stuff you can look at. Like they'll say Baum had these nightmares about scarecrows when he was a kid. That's why he writes about scarecrows. Which is interesting that Scarecrow is this very positive character for sure. Or, you'll get all of these types of parallels. But that can't really stand on its own because that doesn't really tell us anything. It's ultimately trivial. This is sort of my same problem with Hero's Journey. I talk about this all the time when people use Hero's Journey to understand a text. They'll say this is a hero's journey because, here's the crossing the threshold moment. Well, that's just trivia. If you don't have anything deeper than that, that's just trivia. Whereas if you said, if you took that basic parallel and you said, you could do any one of these, but if you said, the wizard is Thomas Edison, you take that from being trivia by connecting it with something like anxiety. A lot of the times, if you take psychological analysis and historical analysis and you really marry them together, I think that's a much more effective way to do historical analysis. So if you just took that parallel and you said the wizard is Thomas Edison, and then you tied it with something like anxiety, and you said the wizard represents technological anxiety, you have a much more sort of deeper understanding of the wizard then and his relationship with any of the other characters. So why do the characters respond to the wizard that way? Technological anxiety. So if you look at TikTok, TikTok's kind of a tricky character to analyze. So if you just looked at TikTok, hush. If you looked at TikTok and you said TikTok is reflecting some of the technological advancements of the time, and if it's that alone, it's just trivia. Well, there happens to be technological advances at the time. Yeah, so what? It's interesting, but it's not, so what? But if you tie that with an emotional response, if you tie that with a visceral response, then that gives you a lot more to talk about. So you can look at, I would say the interesting thing with Dorothy and TikTok, TikTok, there's not much to him. He's kind of a blank slate. But if you look at Dorothy in TikTok and you said, why does Dorothy respond in certain ways to TikTok? Well, she knows the Tin Man, and she has this expectation that he has a desire to be human. He has no interest in being human. So that sort of complicated relationship they have mentally. So you can look at that certainly as a character issue. But you can also look at that idea of technological anxiety. You can compare the wizard and TikTok, and you can say the wizard represents the evil side. I mean, I'm arguing that the wizard is kind of an evil character. He reforms later, but I would argue he's an evil character, certainly in the beginning of the series. He kidnaps Ozma. He's not a good person. But the wizard represents this evil side of technological manipulation. If you tie that with the anxiety that elicits, or the anxiety of that history, the evil implications of technology, you can flip that around and you can apply that to TikTok. You could say TikTok represents the ideals. He's the utopian vision of technology. And you can do that with the Wheelers. You can do that with any sort of a character. Now, that being said, there's an article by Henry Littlefield that I have a lot of people will reference, and a lot of people will, use in essays, or a lot of people will, just a lot of the BuzzFeedy type of listicle references to Oz. Well, they'll reference this article. It is a frustrating article to really deal with because it works that way I was just talking about, where Henry Littlefield is trying to teach about the populist movement. So he'll say things like the Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, and he'll say the Scarecrow is the farmer, and the Tin Man is the industrialist. And so he'll make all of these parallels. But his goal is to teach about the populist movement. I don't have an exhaustive knowledge of the populist movement by any stretch of the imagination. So if I start talking about it, I'm bound to get it wrong. But I can read an article, and the purpose of his article is to teach about the populist movement. It's not to analyze the text. So it's not a literary analysis article. It's a historic. It's for, I think it was originally for a high school class in the 60s. And so he's making all these parallels to help a high school class in the 60s understand the populist movement using the movie, mainly using the movie, but he certainly uses the book too. So if you dig into a reference like the Scarecrow is the farmer, the farmer, and I think what Littlefield says, this is how a lot of people interpret it too, but what Littlefield says is the Scarecrow is the farmer who was not very smart and was fooled by the industrialists. Well, that's a bad interpretation of the Scarecrow. That's a bad interpretation of farmers. Farmers are very intelligent people. There's all kinds of problems with saying farmers are stupid, but that's kind of what Henry Littlefield says. So it's bad interpretation. For the purpose of teaching about the populist movement, works fine, but for the purposes of anything else, it's a problem. But the big problem on a literary analytical level is to say, the Scarecrow is not stupid. That's kind of the whole point. I hate to say that, you've missed the point, but because you can have a lot of different points, but if you just say that the Scarecrow is stupid, that's kind of directly contradictory to a lot of what's said directly throughout the text. He has a developing intelligence, and what he actually needs is confidence. The wizard actually says this at one point. So Littlefield kind of brushes over that. So anyway, it's a problem on multiple levels. But instead of doing that, instead of saying the Scarecrow is the dumb farmer, if you said if you did sort of you married the historical and the psychological, or if you married the historical and some other sort of theoretical concept in there. So sort of like Zenita Fenton does that with historical and feminist, any sort of good, solid historical literary analytical article is going to do this. It's going to marry it with something else. If like the Vivian Wagner article, she marries it with the whole idea of anxiety. So if you look at the Scarecrow, instead of saying the Scarecrow is the dumb farmer, if you said the manipulations of the wizard create this sort of emotional, deep psychological effect in the Scarecrow, you have much more of an analysis there. But if you just said the Scarecrow is the dumb farmer, that's really, really weak, underdeveloped analysis. So that being said, that's my rant about Henry. I could rant all day about that Henry Littlefield article. A lot of people use it. It's has legs over the years, with people referencing it just constantly. I do not think it's a good article for literary analysis. It's an interesting article for trivia, and that's about the extent of it. I do like to tie in some writing advice with these, just because that's my obsession, is creative writing advice. I do want to add that in there just at the end. I'm doing this partly for my students and partly for people stuck at home with coronavirus quarantine and people, that sort of thing. But my obsession is always creative writing, so I will always reference that, given free reign on what I talk about, as long as I've covered, stuff that's useful for my students first. But anyway, so for creative writing, I'm trying to hold two cameras here and cover two cameras. There we go. All right. Here's I ranted about Henry Littlefield. I can rant about Henry Littlefield all day. I can rant about misconceptions about creative writing all day too. But what I would get very frequently is the misconception that realism is the purest and most valid and most valuable permutation and justification and value at the core of all writing whatsoever. Any sort of imagination functions metaphorically. This is wrong, ladies and gentlemen. I assure you, this is incorrect way of thinking about fiction on every level. I'm sorry, I was going to get getting ranty here. But this is, part of the Rainbow Circle. I mean, a lot of the reasons I developed the Rainbow Circle. The Rainbow Circle, when I use it in my class, I call it the 7 analytical levels. Realism is one of the weakest levels that I would argue the power of a realistic piece is really not in the realism of it. That's just a mechanism for achieving something that is actually at the core, which is the visceral stimulation, which is right here. So realism is a mechanism to achieve the visceral stimulation. It's not the pure. So realism is level 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, there you go. My least favorite color, of course. Realism is a mechanism to achieve the visceral stimulation, but you can have visceral stimulation without realism. So if you strip away any other component of the artistic process, you're still left with visceral stimulation. Then you build off of that. You have layers and layers of different value systems, and you have 4 different things that to build until you get into realism. But I'm using realism just to mean depiction of reality. So that sort of mimetic depiction of reality. People get that mixed up with that sort of visceral stimulation. The idea of visceral stimulation must come through the depiction of reality. And so there's a treatment of the imaginative as sort of a secondary permutation, it's just a metaphorical permutation of the depiction of reality. Whereas the transmission of visceral stimulation can be purely irrational, doesn't have to have any sort of relationship with reality. It commonly does, and this is not to say it has to. I mean, a lot of stuff that happens commonly when it comes to people giving advice in writing, they'll mistake things that happen commonly for things that should happen always. Commonly, certainly in fiction, realism would be the mechanism for transmitting visceral stimulation. That doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. So the depiction of reality, it can be a way of, viscerally stimulating. If you see something that's realistic, happening within a story, and if you're attuned to realism as a type of image that can viscerally stimulate you, then that works really effectively. And I just want to point out, it's really in the middle of this. It's really in the middle of the spectrum. This is why it comes up really commonly, because the spectrum, the way it functions, is that the reader, the viewer of the artistic piece, is being pulled both directions. So the reader's being pulled to the core, the stimulating core, being pulled to the outside, the destimulating into the spectrum. If you take an average of those, you'll get somewhere in the middle, and somewhere in the middle is that realism and the realistic and the psychological levels. So because you're being pulled in both directions, that's why on average, it will land on realism. That doesn't mean it's an absolute must. It just means it's something that's common. But ultimately, are we really saying that the value of a work of literature is really derived from its mimetic similarity to something in material existence? I would argue no. That's just a way of getting there, and not the only way of getting there. And so I submit for a direct comparison, Oz, which I have been talking about metaphorically. So I do want to point out that the value of it is not necessarily in the metaphors for the real world. It's not in things representing the real world necessarily. In analytical terms, it's one of the weakest ways to really analyze the text, to say that the value of this text is in how it depicts metaphorically technological developments of the 1890s or what have you. Is that alone the what gives it value? The fact that it's metaphorically depicting these things? There's not a whole lot of aesthetic value there. There's not a whole lot of emotional value there. But if we recognize that even in depicting metaphorically the technological advances of the 1890s, what is the real deeper sort of value of that depiction? I would say in analysis and in recognizing the value of the text for the purposes of creative writing, recognizing the value of the text is in deeper level psychological things like anxiety about technology. How does depiction of technological developments in the 1890s hit you in the core? How does it stimulate you emotionally? I would argue that that's far more complicated and valuable than merely metaphorically depicting that particular time period. That's my rant for today. Two rants for today. My anti-Henry Littlefield rant and my anti, what would I call it? Realist dogmatism. My rant against those two things. But anyway, I will I will charge all of these technologies. Speaking of technological anxiety, I will charge all of these technologies, and I will see you on the next episode. There's that, and there's that, and there's that.